Hello everyone, my name is Caoimhe. I'm the Events Manager with Limerick Chamber. I'd like to extend a warm welcome to today's webinar, Having Difficult Conversations. As this is something we now all have to contend with, we wanted to provide this session to help support you, our members, with helpful tips in preparing and coping with these scenarios. To welcome Anya Barry of Irish Business Training, and we are delighted to collaborate with Irish Business Training to deliver today's session. IBT are a local bespoke training provider who have been in operation for over 20 years. Limerick Chamber has collaborated with IBT on a number of occasions, and we are delighted once again to welcome today's speaker, Anya Barry. We would also like to note that today's webinar is brought to you in sponsorship with Limerick Chamber SkillNet, supporting employers through funding for workplace training. More information on the various training can be found via our website. The SkillNets also support employers in supporting employees through redundancy process by providing career guidance services, CV and interview preparation support, and fully funded training courses for those who have been made redundant to assist them in reskilling. So you can see all of Annette's details there via our website. Before I hand you over to Anya, I would ask that all today's web attendees please get interactive and introduce yourselves, and be sure to network using the chat feature located at the bottom of your screens. And to maximize your learning opportunity today, please don't hesitate to ask questions in the Q&A feature also located at the bottom of your screens. So we really hope you enjoy today's webinar, and I'll now hand you over to the capable hands of Anya.
Thank you, Caoimhe. Well, good afternoon, everybody. And I know in these times it is quite difficult sometimes to have those difficult conversations, particularly if you are doing it remotely. So when Caoimhe asked me to get on board to deliver this, I was more than happy to do that. It's something that we've been delivering at Irish Business Training for a number of months now. Okay, so I suppose to get started, as Caoimhe said, it's hopefully going to be quite interactive. So in the first session, I would just like to ask you about how confident are you when it comes to having a difficult conversation. So Caoimhe is going to introduce a poll there, and we're going to ask you just to rate your confidence when it comes to having these difficult conversations. So 1 is we're not confident at all, and 6 is absolutely, totally confident, no issues. So I might ask you all just to choose from 1 to 6 there and pop it into the poll, please. I think it's just a matter of picking out and selecting a number there. Okay, so we've got so we've got some people there who are quite confident about doing it. So hopefully when we go through the session, we'll find some hints and tips, but I'd also be urging you to share your own thoughts and tips as we go through it, because they may very well help other people. So let's continue there and see. We'll also do a poll again at the end just to see if you've learned some tips as we've gone through the session. If you are not feeling confident, don't worry about it, because research by the Harvard Business School found that actually 67% of all managers were uncomfortable having difficult conversations with the people that they manage. And I suppose the thing about this really is that a lot of this is because there is a fear of the consequences. What will happen if I have this conversation? And there's a fear that maybe my emotions might get in the way of it. And that's a major concern. So again, we're going to use the chat button here. So, because I just want to get a feel for what sort of difficult conversations you want to deal with here today. So, how many of you have been putting off a conversation that you know you need to have? And really what we're looking for here in the chat feature is the type of conversation that you've been putting off. So you might just type in there what type of conversation you might consider even as being a difficult conversation. I know in one of these last sessions that I did, somebody said a difficult conversation for them was having to tell somebody that their personal hygiene wasn't the best. So that might be one. But this is really just for yourselves. What difficult conversations do you have? Would love to see some notes coming in here on the chat buttons there. I'll just give you another minute there. Okay, right. Requesting business funding from potential investors and performance not as expected for the new role. Okay, all right. Okay, all right, let's work with that. So thanks to Colin and Martin for that there. Right. The other thing then as well, for some people, they might have had a conversation that maybe didn't go as well as they expected. And again, that's when they're not ready for a promotion. Okay, so Tara, thank you for that. They may think they're ready for promotion, but you obviously don't think that they are, or their manager doesn't think that they are. Okay, that's fine. Look, we'll take those 3 scenarios and use those as we go through the session. Okay, next question then I just want you again just to type into the chat there is that if you ever had a conversation that didn't go as you hoped, or a conversation that you wish you could redo, what happened in that conversation? So again, it's just to uncover the reasons why people might be slow about having a difficult conversation. Why do you think a conversation might not have gone as well as expected? So again, if you are ready to type that into the chat button, that would be great, into the chat box, just to see what your own thoughts about it are. Okay, maybe now, and I know some of you are probably typing there as we go through it, but let me just go on to the next slide while you're typing that. Sometimes it can be fear of the reaction. Perfect, yeah. Sales clearly presented business case value, didn't clearly separate data involved in the emotion aspects. Martin, that's exactly the case, really. Difficult conversations are usually about something important, and it's all about emotions. And I suppose if you look here to the side here, we assign our own perceptions and interpretations, and because it's something we value, it triggers emotions and stress. And I suppose, to be honest, yeah, Jared, that's a really important point. Jared's saying there that the conversation maybe started without proper planning. And, you know, as we go through the session today, we're going to talk about preparation and how it really is important to prepare for that. Jenny, the performance review there, you responded positively to a request for promoted title and salary at the time, and the hope performance would improve. It didn't, and now rank is with me, and I still haven't sorted out the problem. Okay, and I suppose this is one of the things, Jenny, is that it's important that we tackle it, because avoiding it isn't going to make it go away at all. Okay, I think the key point down here is that we're not well practiced at communicating in times of high emotion, and it's both our emotion and the other person's emotion is a concern here. I often think that when we talk about conflict, we haven't really been trained on how to deal with conflict. Even if you think about it in your childhood, and you know, if you saw your parents dealing with conflict, was it, you know, shouting and roaring? Was it quite aggressive? Was it avoidance? Did we, you know, slam the door and go away? We haven't really had excellent role models in how to deal with conflict. And I think this might be one of the reasons that we are slow about maybe going into a situation, a difficult conversation. And I suppose one of the things that I need to get across to people really here is the importance of adapting a growth mindset as opposed to a fixed mindset when you go into it, because your mindset determines how you approach your difficult conversations. And when we look at what we call the fixed mindset, or the dinosaur brain, if you like, it is all about trying to make sure that we defend ourselves, if you like. But of course, if we are defending ourselves, the other party is also trying to defend themselves. So what we're trying to get to here is, when we're using that growth mindset to have the difficult conversation, we're learning as much during the difficult conversation as we are talking. So we're trying to avoid the talking at somebody. You're having the conversation to learn what's going on in order to improve the situation. And this is really important part to it. In the growth mindset, you're actually adopting an attitude of inquiry. And if you think about it, a good doctor will diagnose the issue through asking a whole series of questions before they reach for the prescription pad. Okay. So what you're trying to do in the difficult conversation is to be open to what the other person has to say before reaching closure in your mind. If you're going into the situation with an idea that what I have is right, so if I go back, who's that now? Jenny, wasn't it? Yeah, so Jenny, go back there now. So if you're going into that situation saying performance hasn't improved, and I'm not saying for one moment that performance has improved, but you're going into that performance hasn't improved. We're trying to adopt an inquiry mindset. So you go in there to find out, why hasn't performance improved? What can that person do to help them And it's not about what you can do to help them. What can that person do to help them to improve performance? So I suppose this is one thing that we need to just get into our minds really clearly here, that adopting that growth mindset where you are using an attitude of inquiry rather than judgment, curiosity rather than judgment. You're trying to have a conversation with them to understand the issues that they're facing. And once you understand the issues, then both of you are going to try and problem solve to ensure that both parties' needs are met. Okay, so how do we do that? I suppose the first thing that I would say to people is that when you want to have the difficult conversation, there are three things that we need to do. The first one is that we need to gain clarity. And there are two things here that we need to consider. Okay, what's the issue, right? And we need to be able to articulate that issue in 2 or 3 clear sentences. Okay, so is it, I believe that your performance is not what's expected. I wanted to have a conversation with you about your behavior in a particular meeting, whatever it is. So the first issue, what's the issue? And you need to be able to articulate that in 2 or 3 clear sentences. The second one then is, what's the outcome that you want? Okay, so when we're looking at the outcome, I'll go on to the next slide here. When we're looking at the outcome, really here we need to be clear on what outcome we want to achieve. Okay, so once we've identified what the outcome is, the next thing is we need to figure out what are the agreed action items that come out of that, because there's no purpose in having this conversation unless change is going to happen. So when we're thinking about the action items that are out there, I want you to think again about what difficult messages do you need to have the conversation about, and then what action would be suitable to come out of that. We need to be clear as well then about what have they agreed to do, when are they going to do it by, and what have you agreed to do, what support you're going to provide to include that, and then there also needs to be a follow-up meeting to evaluate the progress. So in terms of the outcome, a couple of things. What are the actions? Who's going to take responsibility for those actions? What are you going to do and what are they going to do? When is it going to be done by? And can we set a follow-up meeting in place to discuss the progress? If we don't do that follow-up meeting, or if we don't set that follow-up meeting, it's almost as if, oh, thanks be to God, it's over, But the problem with emotions is that there's a journey of emotions, and what starts at annoyance moves to anger and moves to rage. Okay, and that's very clear. Professor Prutnik came up with the wheel of emotion, and he talks about this journey of emotion very clearly here. So the definition of the outcome is really important, okay? Because the conversation is going to be a roller coaster of emotions, but having that outcome clear in your head before you go into it will make sure that it's the stabilizer that pulls you back all the time when you're in the conversation. So I hope that's making a small bit of sense there for you. Okay, the other thing that I'm going to ask you to do here now is consider for a minute how you might have contributed to the situation. So again, I'm going to ask you maybe in the chat button here to put in, when you think about your consideration, so Jenny, if look at you there and talk about the performance review, or Colin, when you talked about your the planning for the business case, how do you think you might have contributed to this situation? And how do you think you can acknowledge your responsibility? So again, I'm going to just ask you just to type that there into the chat button, please, if you don't mind. I sometimes believe that when we're talking about difficult conversations, we're assuming that we're almost blameless in it. But if we can acknowledge and name how we have contributed to the situation, it may actually diffuse some of the emotions coming from the other party, because it prevents that dinosaur brain from kicking in with them. So again, if you could type in there, please, how you think you may have contributed to the situation, that would be great. and then we can move on from there. I'll just give you another minute or two just to type there as we go through it. Okay, so Martin, you could have been more clear in articulating the expectations. Absolutely. So we could focus too much on our own emotions. Perfect. Failure to plan for sure, and assuming that the other party will be familiar with the topic. Exactly. So, you know, once you're clear on how you may have contributed to the situation, when you're opening the conversation, if you acknowledge your contribution, I think it actually, as I say, diffuses the other party's points. So, for example, you know, Martin, you could actually say, look, I wanted to talk to you about this situation, and I'm conscious that maybe I wasn't as clear as I possibly could be in articulating my expectations of the situation. As I say, it diffuses the situation totally, and people start, because if we start saying things like, you know, why didn't this happen, whatever, people will automatically go into that defensive mode. So we want to take that out of it and try and get them to acknowledge that maybe they have a part to play in this situation. And by doing that, the easiest way to do it is by acknowledging our own contribution first. And I think it's something that we don't do enough of. So maybe it's something that you could consider. And say, hopefully you're getting some tips as we go through it. The next one then is, right, in terms of avoidance, okay? A lot of the times we avoid having the situation, again, because we're fearful of what might happen. And I suppose, to think about that, there are 3 questions I think that we need to ask ourselves. Jenny came in, you too could have been clear on expectations. Yeah. I know, Jenny, you're saying that at times you feel that you're nagging. And I think this is why it's so important to have the action items out of it, but also the touch points put in place afterwards to ensure that you evaluate the progress. So that when you're at the end of the conversation, you're saying, listen, I'd like us to meet up, you know, maybe next week at the same time or in a month's time to review how we're both doing in helping us meet this. Okay, so go back to the overruling the avoidance, right? I think there's 3 questions that you need to ask yourself. The first question is, will this conversation help the other person? Okay, so Jenny, if I go back to you at the moment, if there is, you're saying there's a small office there, the situation is rankling with you, it may be rankling with other people as well. So if you don't have this conversation, how is it going to, it could potentially explode. Okay, so by having the conversation, nipping it in the bud, it could potentially help the other person to get on better with people within the organization. Okay, will this conversation help the other person? If they're not performing and they have career ambitions, if you don't have the conversation with them, they will not be able to meet their career ambitions. So therefore, it can absolutely help the other person. The second question is, are my feelings about what might happen causing me to avoid having the conversation? And if you're saying that, yes, it is causing me to avoid having the conversations, then I would say to you is that you don't know what will happen. Okay, you're only making an assumption here. So by asking the questions, you'll find out what will happen. And by having the conversation in a respectful manner, acknowledging your part in it, I think it could potentially produce a very positive outcome. So, you know, your fear about what might happen. What if what you did, what if the conversation actually caused the problem to go away? Wouldn't that be ideal? And the last one, the question then to ask yourself is delivering this message consistent with the reputation that I want to have in the organization? So if the reputation that you want to have in the organization is a reputation of being honest, being authentic, being true, being a good manager, you know, if that's the reputation you want, then you have no choice. You have to have the conversation. So we've looked at the first thing about gaining clarity on the outcome that you want, and then secondly about avoiding. So the next thing that we need to do is to deliver the message. And there's a book out there called Difficult Conversations, How to Discuss What Matters Most by Douglas Stone, Bruce Patton and Sheila Heen. Now, you know, I'm not recommending that you go out and buy it. I found it a useful book, and you know, we get nothing out of it here, but it's just if you wanted to have a read on something that is totally associated with this issue, this is a good book to read. In that book, they say that each difficult conversation is really about three different conversations. There's a what happened conversation, there's a feelings conversation, and then there's the identity conversation. And by dealing with each of these, or by preparing for each of these three conversations, it helps you to be as prepared as you possibly can be. When you're decoding the conversations, the what happened conversation is what's the story here. But remember it, you know, there's your opinion of what happened, and there's the other person's opinion of what happened. There's the feelings conversation, and again, there's yours and theirs, and then there's the identity, and this, again, it's about what does this say about me as an individual, but also what it says about the other. So I'm just going to fly through these very quickly because I want to get onto a bit more of the preparation side of it. Again, you know, if I'm going too quickly for you, or if I'm going too slowly, you know, type it into the chat button. Let me know how you're finding the session so far, because we need to try and make sure that you get what you need out of it. When I'm looking at the what happened conversation, this is back to the point here, is to understand that the situation is more complex than either person alone can see. So we need to approach this conversation with curiosity rather than judgment. And in this, we need to focus on what you're hearing and not on what you're saying. So it's about listening to understand, remembering that there are two different views here, and you've got this opportunity when you're having the conversation with the other person to find out their opinions and their views on it. So when you ask a question, it's important to be comfortable in the silence, to really listen to what they're saying. Okay? We need to acknowledge, if you look, the battle of the message, the orange slides down here is what happens if you adopt that fixed mindset, or the dinosaur brain that I spoke about earlier on, that you know all that there is to know about the conversation, and really you've got to persuade the other person that they're right. Whereas the blue side is the learning conversation, or the growth mindset. And in order to have this conversation, we need to explore each other's stories, and then to share the impact of the other person's actions on you, and find out what they're thinking. What's the impact of your actions on them? So you really need to listen to understand here. And if you are an extroverted individual, it can be quite difficult sometimes to be comfortable in that silence. So when you ask the question, you really do need to be quiet and listen to what that other person is saying. The next feeling, or the next conversation then, is the feelings conversation, okay? And again, exactly the same here. Adopting that mindset here, we need to address the feelings, both mine and theirs, without judgment or blame. And I think one of the things to do here is to really acknowledge their feelings and validate that what they are feeling is okay. Honestly, there is nothing as powerful as when you say to somebody, God, I never thought of it like that. I can really see why that must be frustrating for you now. The minute you start to validate somebody else's feelings, it will diffuse the blame and the defensiveness that they put up there. So it's so important that you really listen and hear the feelings that have been said. And even sometimes people may not name the feelings. They may not say that they're angry, but you might actually name those and say, God, was that really frustrating, or was that how does it make you feel? Having that conversation so that they can actually articulate the feelings. And you know, for a lot of times it was very old school. Let's not talk about feelings. There's no place for emotions at work. The reality of the situation is we all have emotions at work. That's why there's such huge focus on emotional intelligence nowadays. So we really do need to address the feelings, both mine and theirs, without any judgment or blame, with a recognition that they're there. Because if we don't acknowledge those feelings, we won't get to the problem solving phase. And that leads on then to the last conversation, which is the identity conversation. And when we're looking at the identity conversation here, we need to recognize that we need to understand the identity issues that are on the line for both of us, and ensure that dignity is maintained. Okay, because how we view conflict, or how we experience conflict, will affect how we view ourselves, how we view others, and how other people think about us. So in this space, what we're trying to do is we're trying to get to a shared understanding so that both parties can problem solve, take ownership for the solution. And because if they take ownership for the solution, they will then become accountable to it. So that's the core of the book, Difficult Conversations, What Happens, or How to Discuss What Happens Most. And then they take it and they talk about, what do you need to do to have that difficult conversation? And the first is the preparation part. So we're just going to do a small bit on preparation now. And as I say, we need to think about what do you want and don't want? Should you raise it or should you not? And in order to do that, you will need to work through the 3 conversations. And I have a worksheet which will help you, which will allow you to do that too. Okay, so in order to move to a purpose of shared understanding, as I say, it's important to explore how both of us understands the situation and why, what has contributed to that understanding. We need to share the impact of the behaviour on us and seek to understand the other. There's a big difference between intent and impact. So somebody may not intend not to perform, but the impact that it's having on the organisation may be huge. So we're trying to understand all of this in the preparation phase. And in order to do that, we need to look, as I say, at using the 3 conversation model. So when we look at that, okay, what we're looking at here is, you can complete this is the worksheet in terms of the what happened conversation, okay? So you can complete this. This is a really kind of good technique, I suppose, for writing it down, because I feel once we write it down, it makes it easier to identify exactly what's required there. So we're looking at it from 2 sides. So the first is, what's the issue from my point of view? And then we're trying to put ourselves in their shoes to figure out what's the issue from their point of view. And we need then to have the supporting data to show that. And that's all, we can categorize all that down here in this sheet as well. What's the data that supports my point of view and what's the data that supports their point of view? Then we need to think about the contribution. How do we think that they may have contributed to the current situation? And then what's the impact of that on me? And finally, as I say, we're trying to separate the intent from the impact. Okay, what might their intentions have been? And again, you are trying to move to a situation of shared understanding. And then we need to do the same, look at it from my point of view. Okay, so how may I have contributed to the current situation? And this is back to acknowledging our responsibility. And what were my intentions, because we're doing it in reverse here, what were my intentions? And then what do I think the impact may have been on the other person? When we do this, it helps us to look at the situation from the other's point of view. And once we can do that, it will allow us then to start preparing ourselves to go into the conversation with that growth mindset and not the dinosaur brain that we were talking about. So this is, I think this will really get you to start reflecting on the conversation and to see whether it's important to have it or not. And then we move on to the next one then is the feelings and the identity conversation. And again, there's a worksheet very similar to that here, okay? So what do I feel about this situation and what might they be feeling? And we can also identify then what feelings make sense to share. And then if we want to be really deep about it, we can think about what do I fear the situation says about me and what might they fear the situation says about them. Now, I know this is quite, I suppose, deep, if you like, and I would urge you to do it, to try it, I suppose, and that's what I'd suggest you do. Try it and see how it works for you, because I think once we write it down, it allows us to come to terms with our own fears and our own feelings. It allows us to recognize why we may be trying to avoid the conversation, and particularly when we think about the impact of our part to play on it. Once we understand that, it may help us to get through it. So, right, in terms of preparation, so let's go back to the chat button there for a second and just think about, in terms of preparation, what sort of things do you think that we need to prepare, apart from what I've just gone through here, which I know is a bit deep, but if you were thinking about having a difficult conversation, I'm going to ask you to go back into the chat button there again for a second. What sort of things do you think you need to prepare? And then I've got a slide which will take us through it as well. Okay, so hopefully we'll see some comments coming through there now in a second. I'm just going to leave it there now to type in a few things. Okay, so Ger, holding back some material facts, trying to influence the direction of the conversation flow. Okay, right. I think that's a really useful point, because one of the things that we do want to have in the conversation is how are we going to influence the conversation. And the best way to influence any conversation is through asking questions. So, and when we're talking about asking questions, we need to be using what are called TED questions, which is tell, explain, and describe. Okay, so because if you start using closed questions, it can close down the conversation very quickly. And a closed question is a question that has just a yes or no answer. So if you can use the TED questions, so can you describe your thoughts around this, or even if you said, you know, what's your experience of this? You're beginning to get more information which you can lead down a particular path. Okay, the facts in terms of the impact and non-impact. Okay, Martin. Right, so in terms of your preparation, you've got this all down there, impact, non-impact. I'm assuming that's going to be on both parties, the impact on yourself and on the other party as well, and also the non-impact. Yeah, I like that. And the evidence to support the concern, how I will bring it up. Okay, Jenny, that's actually a really important point, is your opening line. How are we actually going to have how are we going to start the conversation? Let me go on there a little bit there for you. Okay, so in terms of preparation, a couple of things that I would be suggesting that we do. And this is just kind of bringing back, you know, a lot of the things that we've spoken about already in the webinar. First one is about naming your feelings. Why do you have them, and are they appropriate? And recognizing that there's more to learn about what happened. Okay, so see this one here is particularly important, I think, about focusing on what's important and not what is just accurate. While we may need to have a difficult conversation, it may also be important to maintain the relationship between you and the other person. So even though they may say something that you think is not particularly accurate, if it's not that important, we just need to let it go. Okay, because, you know, there's the old thing about picking your battles, and I think that's a really important thing. We need to be able to recognize when is it important to defend something and when it's important just to let it go. Okay. As I say, we talked about ways that you have contributed to the problem by action or inaction, because maybe we should have addressed it sooner. And plan your opening line, and this is the point as well that we talked about here, Jenny, with you, how you're going to bring it up, and I'm going to bring you back into that. I just have to get through two more slides first of all before I get to the opening line, so just bear with me for a second if you don't mind. Okay, let's go back into that again. Right, so this is the next stage then. After doing your feelings, your three conversations, your what happened, your feelings, and your identity, the next question is, do you still need to have the conversation? And if so, when are you going to do it? And maybe where are you going to do it? And sometimes when you look at where you're going to have the conversation, you may very well not want to have it in your office, because if you go into the office environment, people may think that they're going to, you know, come in for a performance review. You might want to have it in a meeting room where there's no power. There's an equal sharing of power, if you like, in a meeting room, or maybe you might even want to have it over a cup of coffee to make it more informal. So not alone do you want to think about when to have it, but also where you're going to have the conversation. And then we talked about how you start the conversation, and what will you say to start with the third story? The third story is where you're not looking at it from my point of view or your point of view. We're looking at it from as if there was a mediator or an objective outsider looking at the conversation. How are you going to start the conversation? So you're going to start with that. So we're not looking at apportioning blame or anything like that. how are you going to build psychological safety? And the psychological safety is whereby you are going to ensure that the other person knows that it's safe to speak, it's safe to ask questions, it's safe to put their point of view across. We also need to prepare by figuring out what questions are you going to use to draw out their story, and then how you're going to share your story, what will you say and what will you share. And the last thing in terms of the preparation I would suggest that you do is consider some potential solutions that could be helpful to both of you, not just to one or the other, but to both parties. So again, you know, Jenny, going back to your point there, and we're talking about, you know, an employee maybe that's not performing at the moment. You know, is there more support that needs to be put in place? Is there maybe a mentor that they could work with? That might be a solution from their point of view. From your point of view, you know, what are the KPIs that they are going to have to agree to in order to perform at the standard that you expect them to perform? So you need to have prepared all of these in advance so that when the conversation opens up, that you have some points that you can put forward for discussion, not for that this is the final option here, but this is something that you have considered in the situation. Okay, so let's look then at the opening lines, if you like, or the open sentences in order to create a safe space. Okay, so something like this, I have something I'd like to discuss with you that I think would help us work together more effectively. Or I'd like to talk to you about whatever it is about how you're currently performing, but first I'd like to get your point of view. So in all of these, I'm not putting anything across initially. I'm not putting my point of view across. I'm actually trying to create that safe space so that they don't feel threatened in any way, because I believe the minute that a person feels threatened, what will happen is that they will start fighting back. They will start defending their space, if you like. The other thing that I would say to you is that it's also important to schedule the meeting, but when you're scheduling the meeting, letting them know the purpose of the meeting. So you might say something along the lines of, you know, John, I'd like to talk to you about what happened at the meeting this morning when Bob asked about the missing deadline. Can we grab a cup of coffee tomorrow morning and chat about it? Or Linda, I'd like to go over some of the issues with the ABC customer and some concerns that I have about that. Can we meet tomorrow morning to problem solve? So even though you're scheduling the meeting, you're letting them know the purpose of the meeting so that they can prepare as well. And then when you get into the conversation, I think starting with a sentence like these, it creates that psychological safety that we spoke about, that safe space. So even something here like, I think we have different perceptions about the standard of work that's required at this particular level, and I'd like to hear your thinking about it. Somebody also said to me at one stage that through remote working at the moment, while they could see that people were logged on at work, they weren't actually seeing the outputs that were required. And that was a conversation that they wanted to have, and how were they going to go about it. So again, when you're creating a safe space there, you might want to say something along the lines of, I'd like to talk about how we can ensure that the requirements, the KPIs that are required are being met. I want to ensure that you have the support that you need to see about it or to achieve it. And I'd also like to make sure that we both have the same understanding about what's required. So however you start the conversation, it needs to create that safe space so that we're in a problem-solving mode rather than in a defending mode. In order to do that, I think it is important to use the, I need to go over here now to the, yeah, okay, right. So we've spoken about the making plans and asking for permission, about letting the other person know what's required for them. I also think it's important to use these I statements. Okay, so I wanted to talk to you about the performance standards required for this level, because it's important that we are all sure about what's acceptable and what's not acceptable. And we also need to be clear that what's promoted to management level is acceptable to them. Okay, so it's very clear. It's like, I wanted to talk to you about it. We need to describe observable behavior. And I sometimes find that when we talk about difficult conversations, people will say they have a difficult conversation because somebody else observed something and came to them and told them about the situation. Now, I would be very slow about having a conversation where I have to say, you know, I've got feedback that you aren't performing to the best of your abilities. Okay, because the other person will again go back into that dinosaur brain, will immediately defend and say, who said that? What did they say? What did they mean by that? And you're trying to backtrack from the word go. So if somebody describes a behavior that they have seen, you need to try and put yourself in the situation where you can see it so that you can actually observe it. And now you have evidence to support your conversation when you have it with them. Okay. Then we can go back into the naming the feelings or the states of mind. So I was confused or surprised to see, this particular behavior, and I'd like to get your opinion about how do you see the situation. And again, this is about having that mode of inquiry, of curiosity rather than judgment. Okay, you can bring your thoughts in as a hypothesis. You can say, so I wondered if this was where you were coming from. What do you think? But the most important thing is this constant listening to what the other person is saying, really listening to try to move into that space of understanding. I spoke about the you versus I. Won't worry about any of these. I'm going to send these slides out to you anyway afterwards. Caoimhe is going to send these out to you. Again, if there's anything that I'm not covering here, can you just type it into chat so we can make sure that I get to it before we finish up. The next thing we need to talk about is in terms about how you are going to deliver the message. And there are two things that we need to look at. First of all, there's the directness of the message, and secondly, there is the sensitivity of the message. And I think that it's important that the message is very clear, that there is no ambiguity whatsoever. But we do need to deliver it in such a way that we don't irreparably damage the relationship between you and the other person. Okay, and that's why using that approach of inquiry allows that sensitivity, and it allows for the development of the relationship. But the use of action points, clear action points with identification of who's going to do it and by when it's going to be done by, and following up with a progress ensures that the message is delivered in a direct and concise manner. So in order for the message to be delivered as clearly as possible, my suggestion is that you use that mode of inquiry, your understanding, trying to understand where the other person is coming from, but that there are very clear action items in place at the end of it. I think that having the action items and having the check-in points, the checkpoints maybe a week later or a month later, will ensure that it actually change happens, because that's ultimately what you're looking at here. You want to make sure that that something happens as a result of it. When you're in the conversation as well, I think it really is important to try to avoid using the word but. Okay, this is really important, because the minute you use the word but, if you say yes but, you're almost saying that what has gone before, what you've heard, you don't agree with. So the minute you're saying that, you're putting the other person on the back foot. So, and it also shows that you're not listening. So try to say yes and. So really hear what they're saying and say, yes, I can understand that. And we also now need to look at this. It's only a very small thing, changing the word but to and, but it can make a huge difference. Because again, it's about trying to understand where the other person is coming from. So using in the language like we have here on the right, tell me more. I don't fully understand. Can you explain that in more detail for me? Or you can also summarize what you're hearing. So what I'm hear you saying is this. Is that correct? And it may be and it may not be, but it gives the other person the opportunity then to come back to reaffirm with you. I think it's important during the conversation as well to remember not to take anything personally. Okay, there may be emotions brought to bear in the middle of the conversation. The person may get upset, they may get angry, they may start shouting, but we can't take it personally. Okay, because the minute you start taking it personally, it allows your emotions to come to the surface again. So you need to recenter. And in order to do that, it's important to keep refocusing on the purpose. I know for me, sometimes I would have my diary with me and I would write down the purpose at the top of it. So if I feel myself getting sidetracked, I can look back at that and say, okay, well, this is what I'm here for. This is the reason I'm there. And I can it acts as the stabilizer to bring me back to where I want to go to. Remember to observe your own feelings, because if you don't observe your feelings, if you don't recognize that you are beginning to get angry or you're beginning to get frustrated or whatever it's going to be, if you don't observe that, your emotions can take over and you could actually explode, if you like, because you want to try and separate your feelings from actions. And again, when we're talking about emotional intelligence, we're saying that the feelings is one thing, and we need to be aware of our feelings, but the next thing is self-regulation. But unless we're aware of what's happening, with emotionally, we can't regulate them. I do think it's really vital to remember that this is not, it probably will not be a one-off conversation. It's a journey. It's part of a longer dialogue. So we need to make sure that you schedule those follow-up to make sure that change happens. Now, the next thing then is that you may very well get emotional reactions when you do it. So we'll go back into the chat button here again now for a second. What are you going to do if someone starts crying? Any thoughts on that? Are you going to cry with them, or what's the plan? What are you going to do if somebody starts crying? Offer them the tissue? Again, I'll urge you to type into the chat button there. Okay, while you're doing that there, ask them if they want to take a short break. Absolutely, Jenny. That is one of the things that you could potentially say. Absolutely, clearly say to them, would they like to take a break? Let's see what else. Explain the purpose of the conversation. Exactly. Again, bring it back to the conversation. When we look here at the, I'm going to go into some of these here. Okay, so let's take if they start to cry, you can say, let's just take a minute before we continue. I think it's important. I mean, we need to recognize that sometimes people use emotions to try to avoid the conversation, and they think that if they start crying, that they will actually, if they start crying or if they start getting angry or shouting or whatever, that people will stop the conversation and maybe be even more afraid to get back into it again. We need to make sure that that doesn't happen. So whether they cry or get angry or whether they start blaming or whatever, we need to ensure that they know we are continuing this conversation. So we'll take a minute before we continue. Or if they get really upset, you might say, do you want to take 10 minutes there and we'll come back and we'll have the conversation. But it's really important that you don't postpone the conversation. We need to, Martin, I see exactly what you're saying there. You need to understand what drives this emotion. You absolutely do. So you can say things like, I can hear that you're angry, or I can see that you're really upset, and I'm just wondering what's causing that. You're trying to ask the questions to understand where the other person is coming from. And that's going to be vitally important. These are kind of maybe helpful phrases that might help you to drive on through the conversation. So, you might ask questions like, what has held you back from meeting your commitments? If you're talking about somebody who hasn't delivered on a particular key point, okay? And again, that's a question that would help you to understand where they're coming from. The second thing is that, I believe that even though you're saying that you're doing this, you're getting to this workload, I'm not seeing it on the other side. So you're saying one thing but doing another. How can we make sure that what you're saying is translated into action so that I can see it? And what can I do to support you? And I think this is a really important thing as well, because if we're looking at joint problem solving, we're looking at both parties taking the opportunity to work together to resolve this. And I honestly think that, you know, once we start doing this, once we start helping the other person and showing our support for them, you're going to get to a solution far better. And again, the last sentence there is about, you know, maybe helping to take responsibility here and trying to diffuse any blame game that might happen on the other party's side by saying something like, we appear to have a misunderstanding, and maybe that's because I wasn't very clear on my expectations. You know, and I'd like to know from you how I can be as clear as possible. There is, as I say, these are all going to be shared with you. There's a YouTube video there, about 4 or 5 minutes, about having a difficult conversation. Again, useful to listen to it. It's Mel Robbins. She's a very good person. It's a small little bit American, but the core message is there, and I've pulled a lot of it into this conversation anyway, here anyway. When you're having the difficult conversation, I suppose if I'm looking at kind of what are the key points to take away from this, okay? The first one is that it's important that you ground yourself. The first conversation to have is with yourself, and that's those preparations, looking at the what happened conversation, the feelings conversation, and the identity conversation. Creating a safe space by having that opening line ready, which shows that you are there to understand the situation and not to judge or to blame. To really listen with curiosity and care, okay? Stephen Covey, in his book, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, talked about seeking first to understand and then to be understood. Again, remembering things can be interpreted in multiple ways, so separating that impact from intent, okay? So while I know what the impact of somebody else's behavior might be on me and on maybe others within the team, I don't actually know what they intended. So the conversation is to focus on what they intended so that we can both problem solve. To try and use the yes and stance as opposed to the but. And remembering that the minute you use the word but, it suggests that what the other party has said before that is invalid or incorrect. Recognizing your own perceptions and your own stories. What are the things that you are bringing? What are the perceptions that you are bringing to bear on this? And remember, nobody is ever all black or all white. We're all shades of grey. So sometimes we have this horns versus halos effect. When we see somebody do something wrong, and we believe that they're maybe not performing at their capabilities at the moment, then it's about, you know, us. The minute we see them doing something wrong, we say, "Oh, I was right all along." They really are useless at their job. That's a story that we're telling ourselves. So we need to separate the assumptions that we have from the actual facts. Using the I statements and to reinstate the importance of change, you know, and this is where it's so important to ensure that there are action steps put in place and checkpoints. So that you're asking, so at the very end of the conversation, you're bringing it all back and saying, look, so, you know, the purpose of the conversation was to understand where you're coming from, and to allow us to come up with a situation where we can ensure that this is going to happen. Is there anything else you'd like to add at this stage? And then I suppose this is the kind of the overview of all of the things that we spoke about here. And I suppose while we are looking at that really and considering it, I do want to leave, you know, the last 5 minutes for questions. So, you know, if anybody has questions, they can type them into the chat box. Also to say that Cuiva and Limerick Chamber Skill Nets have identified a number of, if people would like to have an individual coaching session about a particular difficult conversation that they would like to have, and they want to just maybe talk the preparation through or with me, I have some slots available next week. So on Monday, the 28th of September, you can book an hour slot with me at 12, 1 or 2 o'clock. On Tuesday, the 29th of September at 8 or 9 a.m. or at 2 p.m. or 4 and 5 p.m. and on Friday, the 2nd of October before 12 noon. So you can coordinate that. I put my email address there into the chat box there. And if anybody wants to book that slot with me, we can do that.
Anya, as well, we'll be releasing your email in the post-events email there as well. So if you do want to book those slots, or if there's any slots you've identified that you'd like to talk to Anya a little bit more about, you can get in touch with either myself or Anya, and I'll get you to touch base with each other.
Now, if anybody has any questions that they would like to add here, thanks, Caoimhe, for that. If anybody has any questions that they would like to just put up there into chat, please feel free to do it now. We've got 5 minutes left, and you can be doing that there while I just do a quick overview on this slide for you, so that we all have this is kind of the last slide on it. The first thing that we spoke about was about changing your mindset. If we continue to use the same thinking and the same mindset, we're going to get the same old results. So we're trying to, when you're going into that difficult conversation, you're going into that conversation with a mindset of curiosity rather than judgment. We need to plan for it, and in order to have to help us plan, we need to look at the three different conversations that are spoken about in the book, Difficult Conversations, How to Discuss What Matters Most. And part of the conversation is going to be acknowledging your counterpart's perspective. So part of the preparation is looking at it not just from your point of view, but also from the other person's point of view. Acknowledging your responsibility, or is, you know, what you have done to contribute to it, allows you to give something back. And then slowing down and really listening to what's been said and what's not being said. Sometimes, you know, when there's silence there, we need to really ask the question. And, you know, you might be saying something like, you know, I think that this is really upsetting for you, but I really would like to get your point of view here. And if there's silence, we need to say things along, you know, this is serious, and, you know, unfortunately, we cannot move forward unless we resolve this. And I really do want to get your point of view here. Again, in one of the slides there, I've put in there about using how to deal with silence as a tactic. So you will have all of these slides that you can refer back to. Caoimhe is going to send those out to you immediately after the session. Okay, we don't have any questions coming through, so hopefully that has given you a bit of a clearance or a steer. So we might just, Caoimhe, put up that last poll just to see how confident you're now feeling after the session and the slides that you will have, how confident you're going to be about, are you more prepared to have these difficult conversations? And this is just to help us, give us a little bit of feedback as well for more of these sessions that we need to have. Okay, so thanks to everybody for taking part there. Great to see the comments coming in. As I say, if anybody does need any further guidance or help, feel free to get in touch with either myself or Caoimhe, and we'll book that session with you, that 1 hour coaching session, which is sponsored by Skillnets, I believe, Caoimhe, isn't it?
It is indeed. Thank you so much, Anya. That was absolutely fantastic. And we'll share the recording with all of our participants in the coming days once it's designed and everything. So, and like that, if there are any questions you have, don't hesitate to pop them on to me and I'll connect you with Anya, and I'll be popping out Anya's email address as well. I hope you have a lovely day.
Thank you, Caoimhe.